The Alpha King chose another woman. Then the rejected Omega disappeared without a goodbye. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before we begin, if you enjoy heartfelt stories about destiny, sacrifice, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new journey. Now, imagine loving someone so quietly that the person who mattered most never realized your silence was slowly breaking your heart. In the kingdom of Ashen Hollow, where every pack measured worth through strength, rank, and ancient bloodlines, the greatest acts of kindness were often the easiest to overlook. Xantha Whitmore understood that truth better than anyone. An Omega with pale blonde hair, gray-blue eyes, and a gentle spirit, she possessed an uncommon gift for calming frightened wolves and easing the pain of both body and soul. Yet those quiet talents rarely earned admiration in a court that celebrated power above compassion. Even after years of whispered insults and dismissive glances, she refused to let bitterness replace kindness. She stitched blankets for orphaned pups during harsh winters, gathered herbs for aging healers before sunrise, and quietly left baskets of fresh bread outside the homes of widows who could no longer work. Most people never discovered who had helped them. Xantha preferred it that way. Her late mother had taught her that goodness did not become more valuable simply because someone applauded it. There was only one place where Xantha ever allowed herself to hope for something more. On quiet evenings, after court meetings had finally ended and the castle had grown still, she often crossed paths with Bryce Ashford on the western balcony overlooking the endless forest. The Alpha King rarely spoke about politics there. Instead, he stood beneath the moonlight, grateful for a few peaceful moments away from expectations that followed him everywhere. Xantha never interrupted the silence unless he wished to talk. Sometimes they watched distant storms roll across the mountains. Sometimes they shared warm tea while saying almost nothing at all. Once, years earlier, Bryce had returned from inspecting the border with a deep cut across his hand after dismissing it as insignificant. Xantha had quietly cleaned the wound without scolding him, wrapped it with practiced care, and smiled when he apologized for staining the bandages with blood before she had even finished tying them. As he prepared to leave, she simply said, "Strong hands deserve to heal too." Bryce had laughed softly, a rare sound few people in the palace ever heard. From that day forward, whenever duty became overwhelming, he often found himself walking toward the western balcony without consciously asking why. Neither of them ever named what slowly grew between those ordinary moments. Bryce believed there would always be another evening to speak more honestly. Xantha believed patience was another form of faith. As the annual choosing ceremony approached, excitement spread through every territory. Noble daughters arrived wearing elegant gowns embroidered with silver thread, influential families negotiated alliances behind closed doors, and merchants decorated the capital with banners bearing the royal crest. Every corridor echoed with confident predictions about the future queen. Xantha tried not to listen. Instead, she spent her mornings preparing healing supplies for guests traveling long distances and calming anxious children overwhelmed by the crowds. Her closest friend once teased her, asking whether she had thought about wearing something beautiful to the ceremony. Xantha only smiled before adjusting the little silver pendant her mother had left her years ago. It rested close to her heart every day, not as a symbol of destiny, but as a reminder never to lose herself while waiting for life to unfold. Across the palace, Bryce carried responsibilities no one else could fully understand. The royal council insisted that his marriage would shape the kingdom's future, and powerful alpha houses competed for influence with promises of soldiers, wealth, and political stability. Bryce listened carefully to every proposal, yet none of those conversations brought him the quiet certainty he found during those unremarkable evenings on the western balcony. More than once, after exhausting council sessions, he looked instinctively toward the garden paths, expecting to glimpse a familiar figure carrying herbs or speaking gently to frightened pups. He never questioned why those moments brought him peace. He simply accepted them as part of palace life, never imagining they could disappear. On the eve of the choosing ceremony, moonlight settled across the white roses blooming beneath the palace walls. Xantha stood alone among them, unaware that the hope she had protected for so many years was about to be tested in ways neither she nor Bryce could possibly foresee. Morning arrived beneath a sky washed in silver, as Ashen Hollow awakened to the solemn rhythm of the choosing ceremony. Noble families filled the grand hall in velvet and jeweled embroidery, every smile polished, every greeting carefully measured. Xantha Whitmore remained where she had always felt most useful, guiding elderly guests to their seats, calming restless children overwhelmed by the crowds, and quietly bringing warm tea to exhausted servants who had been working since before dawn. Few people noticed her, yet countless small problems disappeared wherever she passed. The kingdom celebrated power, but it often survived because of people like her. Across the hall, Bryce Ashford entered beneath the royal banners, and conversation dissolved into respectful silence. His expression carried the calm authority expected of an alpha king, though beneath that composure rested a mind burdened by responsibilities no ceremony could lighten. Lords bowed. Advisors stood proudly beside the moon altar, convinced the months of negotiation were finally reaching their reward. Before taking his place, Bryce's eyes wandered almost instinctively across the crowded chamber. Near the rear of the hall, he found Xantha kneeling beside a frightened little girl whose ceremonial ribbon had come undone. With patient hands, Xantha retied the ribbon, brushed away the child's tears, and smiled until the girl laughed again before running back to her family. Bryce watched a heartbeat longer than he intended. It was such an ordinary moment that no one else seemed to notice, yet something about it settled the tension inside him, just as it always had. "Your Majesty." The voice of the High Chancellor quietly pulled him back. Bryce turned away, and the moment slipped behind him. The ancient blessing began beneath the pale stone altar, echoing through the vaulted ceiling as elders spoke of loyalty, sacrifice, and the burden of leadership. Every word reminded Bryce that today was expected to secure the kingdom's future, not his own happiness. Across the chamber, Xantha lowered her gaze and wrapped trembling fingers around the small silver pendant hidden beneath her gown. She had never expected promises. She had only hoped that years of quiet understanding might someday become enough. When the blessing ended, the council invited Bryce to make the ceremonial choice before every gathered pack. The hall fell completely silent. One deliberate step after another carried him across the polished marble floor. For the briefest instant, his eyes drifted toward the place where Xantha stood. She met his gaze with the same gentle expression she had always worn, neither asking nor expecting anything from him. Bryce almost stopped. The hesitation lasted no more than a heartbeat. Then another voice reached him. "The kingdom is watching, Your Majesty." Without another pause, he continued forward until he stood before Celeste Hawthorne. Elegant, composed, and respected throughout the Northern Territories, Celeste accepted his extended hand with quiet dignity rather than triumph. Applause rolled through the chamber like distant thunder. Council members exchanged relieved smiles. Noble families celebrated the alliance they had spent months arranging. Xantha did not cry. She did not plead. She simply felt something inside her become astonishingly still. She bowed respectfully toward Bryce and Celeste, offering them the grace neither of them had asked from her, then stepped backward into the crowd before anyone noticed she was leaving. Bryce acknowledged the congratulations surrounding him, but an unexpected uneasiness refused to disappear. Almost without thinking, he glanced back toward the rear of the hall, searching for the familiar gray-blue eyes that had quietly grounded him through countless ordinary days. The place where Xantha had been standing only moments before was empty. He took an unconscious half-step in that direction before another wave of officials surrounded him with ceremonial duties, signatures, and formal greetings. By the time he looked again, she was gone, and although the celebration unfolded exactly as tradition demanded, something invisible had already begun slipping beyond his reach. The celebration spilled from the grand hall into every courtyard of Ashen Hollow, where musicians filled the crisp afternoon with triumphant melodies and servants carried silver trays through clusters of smiling guests. Yet beneath the polished spectacle, Xantha Whitmore moved unnoticed, gathering abandoned cloaks, comforting tired children, and quietly finishing the responsibilities no one else considered important. Every cheerful laugh seemed farther away than the last. She did not blame Celeste Hawthorne, whose grace remained sincere even while surrounded by endless congratulations. Nor did she resent Bryce Ashford. What hurt was realizing that she had built an entire future around moments he might never have understood. As twilight settled over the palace, Xantha returned to the modest chamber she had occupied for years within the healer's wing. The room contained little beyond neatly folded clothes, shelves lined with dried herbs, several handwritten journals, and the small silver pendant that had never left her neck since childhood. She removed it carefully and studied its delicate engraving, remembering her mother's gentle voice reminding her that true worth could never be measured by titles or applause. For the first time, those words no longer sounded comforting. They sounded like permission to stop waiting. While the festivities continued elsewhere, she quietly packed only what she truly needed into a weathered leather satchel. Every object she left behind represented a life she had believed would one day become her own. Across the palace, Bryce endured an endless procession of formal greetings, political discussions, and ceremonial toasts. Council members praised his judgment. Visiting alphas spoke confidently about stronger alliances and prosperous years ahead. Bryce answered each conversation with calm restraint, but an unexpected distraction lingered in the back of his mind. Several times, he found himself scanning the crowded rooms without consciously deciding to do so. He noticed the elderly healer searching for fresh medicinal herbs without Xantha's usual assistance. He noticed frightened young pups looking around as though expecting someone who always greeted them with patience. As another reception came to an end, Bryce quietly excused himself and stepped into the cool evening air. Without thinking, his feet carried him toward the western balcony. Moonlight washed across the familiar stone floor where countless quiet evenings had passed between duty and silence. The carved railing overlooked the endless forest, and the breeze gently stirred the climbing vines that framed the old balcony. For one brief moment, Bryce found himself expecting to hear the soft rustle of a sage-green cloak. He waited. Nothing. His gaze settled on the small stone table where they had once shared warm tea after exhausting council meetings. One porcelain cup still rested there, forgotten by a servant after the ceremony preparations. He took a slow step forward before stopping himself. The balcony had never seemed so empty. For several silent heartbeats, he remained there, staring toward the dark forest as though someone might still appear carrying fresh herbs, offering one quiet smile before asking whether the council meeting had been difficult. No one came. At last, Bryce turned back toward the brightly lit corridors where duty continued waiting for him. Yet for the first time since becoming Alpha King, returning to his responsibilities felt less like walking toward certainty and more like leaving something important behind without understanding why. Later that night, Celeste approached him privately before another reception began. She observed him with thoughtful eyes rather than accusation. "You're here," she said softly, "but your thoughts are somewhere else." Bryce offered a courteous smile and dismissed it as exhaustion, though his answer failed to convince either of them. Celeste did not press further. Instead, she admitted that the palace felt strangely different that evening, as though one gentle light had quietly gone out. Her words remained with Bryce long after she walked away. Meanwhile, Xantha visited one final place before dawn. Beyond the castle gardens stood a modest stone memorial honoring healers who had devoted their lives to protecting every pack regardless of rank. She placed a single white rose beneath her mother's name and whispered a promise carried away by the cool breeze. She would no longer remain where her presence depended upon someone else's recognition. Whatever waited beyond the kingdom, she would face it with the same compassion her mother had taught her, but this time she would choose her own path. As the eastern horizon brightened, she handed the keys to her chamber to the elderly head healer, thanking him for every lesson he had shared. He sensed unspoken sorrow in her smile and asked whether she would return after the celebrations ended. Xantha paused only briefly before answering with quiet honesty that she did not know what tomorrow would bring. Moments later, wrapped in a simple traveling cloak, she stepped through the northern gate just as the first rays of sunlight touched the distant mountains. Behind her, the palace continued preparing for days of royal festivities, completely unaware that the woman whose kindness had quietly held so many fragile pieces together had begun walking toward an unknown future. Xantha Whitmore did not look back after passing through the northern gate, even when the distant bells of the palace drifted across the valley behind her. Each step carried her farther from the only home she had ever known and closer to a future with no promises except the freedom to choose it herself. The forest road stretched between towering pines, where cool air carried the scent of cedar and damp earth instead of polished marble and royal expectation. Travelers occasionally passed in horse-drawn wagons, but few noticed the quiet young woman walking alone with nothing more than a weathered satchel and the silver pendant resting beneath her cloak. By midday, she reached the village of Briar Crossing, a peaceful settlement nestled beside a winding river. The local healer, an elderly widow named Miriam, recognized immediately that Xantha possessed years of training despite her modest appearance. Without asking unnecessary questions, Miriam invited her to assist with an injured lumberjack whose leg had been crushed beneath a fallen tree. Xantha worked with calm precision, cleaning the wound, preparing herbal compresses, and speaking gently enough to steady the frightened man's breathing. Before sunset, word had already spread that a gifted young healer had arrived unexpectedly. For the first time in many years, strangers looked at Xantha with gratitude instead of quiet judgment. Back at Ashen Hollow, the final celebrations ended beneath fading lanterns, leaving the palace strangely hollow despite its grandeur. Bryce Ashford expected to see familiar routines resume, yet small disruptions appeared everywhere. The orphan pups asked why Miss Xantha had not visited them. The infirmary lacked the organized efficiency everyone had taken for granted. Even senior servants admitted they had no idea where certain medicinal supplies had been stored because Xantha had always handled those tasks herself without seeking recognition. The absence that had begun as a passing thought slowly became impossible to dismiss. Bryce finally summoned the head healer, expecting to hear that Xantha had taken a short leave after the exhausting ceremonies. Instead, the elderly man quietly placed a small ring of bronze keys upon the king's desk. "She returned these before sunrise," he explained. "She thanked us for everything, and left without saying where she intended to go." The words settled over the room with unsettling weight. Bryce stared silently at the worn keys, suddenly remembering countless ordinary moments he had overlooked. Warm tea appearing beside exhausted guards during winter patrols, flowers placed at forgotten memorials, frightened children smiling the instant Xantha entered a room. None of those memories had seemed extraordinary at the time. Together they painted a truth he had never paused long enough to see. Hoping to understand, Bryce walked alone that evening through the palace gardens until he reached the western balcony, where they had once shared brief conversations between royal obligations. The space stood empty beneath the rising moon. Resting on the stone railing, almost hidden beneath a flower pot, lay a folded piece of linen embroidered with tiny silver wildflowers. Bryce recognized it immediately. Years earlier, Xantha had quietly mended a torn ceremonial cloak with that same delicate pattern after he had dismissed the damage as unimportant. He had forgotten the gesture. She never had. As he held the cloth in his hands, an unexpected memory surfaced with painful clarity. On that evening, she had smiled and said, "Sometimes the smallest things hold together what everyone else believes is already strong." At the time, he had barely listened. Now those words echoed with unbearable meaning. For the first time since ascending the throne, Bryce questioned whether the decision praised by his council had already cost him something far greater than political security. Far beyond the kingdom's borders, unaware that anyone had begun searching for answers within themselves, Xantha paused beside a quiet river as a hooded traveler approached from the opposite bank and spoke her name with unmistakable familiarity. The stranger lowered his hood with unhurried calm, revealing a weathered face, shaped more by years of service than hardship. Silver hair framed thoughtful eyes that softened the moment they met Xantha Whitmore's. "You don't remember me," he said gently, "but I promised your mother that if life ever carried you beyond Ashen Hollow, I would help you find your own way." Instinctively, Xantha's fingers closed around the silver pendant beneath her cloak. The man introduced himself as Gideon Mercer, a healer who had studied beside her mother long before she was born. He spoke neither of destiny nor hidden prophecies. Instead, he described a quiet sanctuary where healers from many territories lived by one simple belief, that every life deserved compassion before judgment. Listening to him, Xantha felt something unfamiliar growing inside her. For the first time since leaving the palace, she was not merely escaping the past. She was beginning to imagine a future that belonged entirely to her. After one last glance toward the distant mountains hiding Ashen Hollow beyond the horizon, she accepted Gideon's invitation. Together they crossed the old stone bridge leading away from everything she had once waited for. And with every step, she became less the woman who had been left behind and more the woman she was choosing to become. Back inside the royal palace, Bryce Ashford found no comfort in victory. The embroidered cloth resting upon his desk had become an unexpected reminder of everything he had failed to notice. He began asking questions no king had ever considered important. Guards remembered winter nights when Xantha refused to leave injured patrols until every wound had been treated. Kitchen workers quietly admitted that meals had often appeared for hungry servants because she had given away her own portions. Stable hands recalled mornings when frightened horses calmed the instant she entered the barn. Piece by piece, Bryce discovered that the quiet strength holding countless ordinary lives together had never come from royal authority. It had come from one woman who had never asked to be seen. The realization settled heavily upon him. He understood that he had not lost Xantha during the choosing ceremony alone. He had been losing her little by little each time he assumed she would always remain. Determined to find her, Bryce summoned the royal council and announced his intention to begin a personal search. The chamber erupted almost immediately. "Your Majesty," the High Chancellor warned, "if the Alpha King abandons the capital now, neighboring pacts will see uncertainty. Rivals have waited years for such an opportunity." Another elder added, "The choosing ceremony has only just ended. Leaving for one departed Omega could unravel every alliance we have secured." A third advisor spoke even more bluntly. "History will remember this as the moment an Alpha placed personal feelings above his kingdom." Silence settled across the council chamber. Bryce looked slowly around the room, realizing every argument they offered would have sounded reasonable only days earlier. At last, he spoke with quiet certainty. "If preserving this throne requires me to ignore the cost of my own decisions, then I am protecting a crown instead of a kingdom." Without raising his voice, he reached for the royal decree awaiting his seal. The council watched in stunned silence as he signed the order authorizing a kingdom-wide search, accepting full responsibility for whatever political consequences might follow. No applause greeted the decision. No advisor offered approval. Bryce understood that some of those standing before him might never trust his judgment again. Even so, for the first time in many years, the path ahead felt honest. Later that evening, Celeste Hawthorne requested a private meeting. She studied him for a long moment before removing the ceremonial bracelet, symbolizing their public union, and placing it gently upon the table between them. "You fulfilled everyone's expectations," she said with quiet grace, "except your own." She offered him a warm, understanding smile rather than resentment. A queen should never be chosen because she makes a kingdom comfortable, and another woman should never disappear, carrying the weight of a silence that was never hers to bear. Bryce lowered his eyes, unable to argue. Outside, steady rain washed across the palace rooftops as though erasing the final echoes of celebration. Far beyond the borders of Ashen Hollow, Xantha walked beside Gideon toward an unfamiliar future, unaware that behind her an Alpha King had willingly placed his reputation, his political security, and perhaps even his throne at risk, not to reclaim what he had lost, but because he finally understood that some mistakes could only be honored by facing their consequences. News of Bryce Ashford's unprecedented order spread across Ashen Hollow before sunrise, leaving ministers unsettled and neighboring pacts quietly suspicious. Never before had an Alpha King redirected royal resources to search for a single woman who had departed by her own choice. Some advisors warned that rival territories would mistake compassion for weakness. Others argued that the throne itself depended upon Bryce returning his attention to politics instead of the past. Bryce listened without interruption, then issued one additional instruction that surprised even his closest commanders. "No one is to pressure her into returning," he said calmly. "If you find Xantha Whitmore, you will tell her only one thing, that she is free to choose her own path. My duty is to know she is safe, not to decide where she belongs." The order changed the nature of the search entirely. It was no longer a mission to bring someone home. It became an act of respect for the choice she had already made. Far beyond the kingdom's borders, Xantha arrived with Gideon Mercer at the secluded sanctuary nestled within a peaceful valley surrounded by towering cliffs. There, healers from distant lands worked side by side without asking about bloodlines, noble titles, or pack status. Patients were welcomed before questions were asked. The quiet generosity unsettled Xantha almost as much as it comforted her. She had spent years believing kindness required endurance, yet here compassion flowed naturally in every direction, including toward herself. As the days passed, children instinctively reached for her hand. Frightened wolves settled at the sound of her voice, and even experienced healers began seeking her opinion. Gideon watched silently before deciding the time had finally come. One evening, beneath the soft glow of oil lamps, he placed a carefully preserved envelope into Xantha's hands. Its wax seal carried the same delicate wildflower engraved upon her silver pendant. "Your mother asked me to keep this until you discovered your own worth without depending on another person's choice," he said quietly. Xantha broke the seal with trembling fingers. The letter contained no hidden lineage, no forgotten prophecy, and no promise that destiny would erase her pain. Instead, her mother's graceful handwriting offered something far more enduring. Asterisk, my dearest Xantha, if you are reading this, it means life has led you to a crossroads where love and sorrow have become difficult to separate. Never believe that your value depends on being chosen. The right people will walk toward your light. They will never ask you to spend your life standing in their shadow. If you must leave a place to protect the kindness inside your heart, then leave without shame. A heart that remains gentle after disappointment has already won a victory greater than pride can ever understand. Asterisk, tears quietly blurred Xantha's vision. For years, she had mistaken patience for devotion and silence for strength. Now she understood what her mother had hoped she would one day discover. Love should never require someone to disappear inside another person's life. The silver pendant resting in her palm no longer felt like a reminder of what she had lost. It had become a promise to herself. At nearly the same time, Bryce visited the modest memorial where Xantha had placed a single white rose before leaving Ashen Hollow. The elderly head healer told him she had spoken no words of resentment before her departure. She thanked this kingdom, the old man said softly, because it taught her the moment kindness must also include herself. Bryce closed his eyes as those words settled into his heart. He finally understood that Xantha had not walked away to punish him. She had walked away because remaining would have slowly erased the woman she was. Just as that realization took hold, a messenger arrived at the sanctuary carrying troubling news. Unknown wolves had begun asking careful questions about a gifted healer wearing a silver pendant, and before anyone could decide what the warning truly meant, the sanctuary's outer bell rang 3 sharp times, announcing unexpected visitors at the gate. The sanctuary bell echoed across the valley a second time before its solemn vibration finally faded into the surrounding cliffs. Every healer paused where they stood, exchanging uneasy glances. Gideon Mercer stepped toward the entrance with measured confidence, while Xantha remained beside the stone courtyard, instinctively resting one hand over the silver pendant hidden beneath her cloak. Moments later, several travelers were escorted through the gates. They wore no royal insignia, carried no drawn weapons, and introduced themselves as messengers seeking information on behalf of distant territories concerned about rumors surrounding an extraordinary healer. Their spokesman spoke politely, yet Gideon sensed the careful precision behind every question. Before allowing them farther inside, he calmly informed them that the sanctuary existed beyond political influence and offered aid to anyone in need without revealing the identities of those under its protection. The visitors accepted his answer with respectful smiles, but as they departed, one of them glanced toward Xantha with unmistakable recognition before disappearing beyond the valley path. The brief exchange left an uncomfortable silence hanging over the sanctuary. Gideon wasted no time. That evening he gathered the senior healers and quietly explained that word of Xantha's remarkable abilities had begun spreading much faster than expected. In troubled times, extraordinary compassion often attracted both gratitude and ambition. He urged everyone to remain vigilant until they understood who was truly searching for her and why. Meanwhile, Bryce Ashford followed the trail his scouts had pieced together over several exhausting days. Every village they visited offered nearly identical memories. A gentle young woman had treated injuries without requesting payment, comforted frightened families, and departed before anyone could properly thank her. None of the stories praised noble heritage or royal connections. They spoke only of kindness freely given. Bryce listened in silence, each account deepening his awareness of how little he had truly seen while she stood beside him every day. At sunset, one elderly farmer presented Bryce with a neatly folded blanket. She repaired this before leaving, the man explained. When I asked why she cared so much about strangers, she smiled and said that people should never have to earn compassion. Bryce lowered his head, recognizing the quiet conviction that had always guided Xanda's life. At that moment, he understood the greatest truth he had avoided since the choosing ceremony. He had mistaken constancy for certainty. Because Xanda never demanded attention, he had assumed she would always remain. The realization struck with painful clarity. He had not lost her in a single public decision. He had been losing her through countless unnoticed moments long before that day. Determined to correct what still could be corrected, Bryce continued toward the mountains despite repeated warnings from his council to return. Back at the sanctuary, Gideon finally shared one last truth he had withheld. Xanda's mother had not asked him to prepare her daughter for a royal destiny or hidden inheritance. She had asked him to protect one simple choice. If the day ever came when Xanda discovered her own worth beyond another person's acceptance, no one, not a king, a council, nor even old friends, should persuade her to surrender that hard-earned freedom out of guilt or obligation. The promise had guided every decision Gideon made since her arrival. Xanda listened quietly before thanking him with tearful gratitude. She no longer wished to return to the woman she had once been. She wished only to become the one her mother had believed she could be. Before dawn the following morning, the sanctuary gates opened once more. This time there was no uncertainty about the lone traveler approaching along the mountain road. Dust covered his cloak after days of relentless riding, yet his posture remained unmistakable. Bryce Ashford had come alone, leaving behind his royal escort, political authority, and every symbol of power. As his eyes finally met Xanda's across the quiet courtyard, neither of them moved. Between them stood not only miles of distance, but every unspoken choice that had led them to this moment. And whether the next words would heal two wounded hearts or separate them forever remained uncertain. For several long heartbeats, neither Bryce Ashford nor Xanda Whitmore spoke. The quiet valley seemed to breathe around them, carrying only the sound of wind moving through tall pines and distant water flowing across smooth stones. Bryce had crossed mountains without soldiers, advisors, or royal ceremony. He stood before her not as the Alpha King, but as a man finally willing to face the consequences of his own choices. Xanda studied him carefully. The confidence that had once surrounded him had been replaced by something quieter, something earned rather than inherited. Gideon Mercer recognized the moment belonged to them alone and quietly withdrew, leaving the courtyard undisturbed. Bryce stopped several steps away, careful not to shorten the distance she had fought so hard to reclaim. "I didn't come to ask you to return," he said at last. "I came because too much was left unsaid." Xanda listened patiently, no longer searching his face for answers she needed in order to feel complete. Bryce continued, his voice free of royal authority. "I believed sacrifice meant denying my own heart for the good of everyone else. I never realized I was asking someone else to make that sacrifice with me." Xanda lowered her eyes for only a moment before answering with quiet honesty. "And I believed waiting long enough would eventually make me worthy of being chosen." We were both wrong. Neither of them argued. Neither tried to erase the past. The truth settled gently between them, no longer as a wound, but as something finally understood. Life around the sanctuary continued without interruption. Children laughed while gathering herbs. Patients thanked the healers preparing fresh remedies. An elderly traveler struggled to carry heavy buckets from the nearby, well before Bryce instinctively stepped forward to help. No one recognized him as a king. He spent the remainder of the afternoon repairing a broken fence, hauling water, chopping firewood, and cleaning treatment rooms alongside volunteers who assumed he was simply another weary traveler offering his hands where they were needed. When one young wolf pup grew frightened during a bandage change, Bryce paused uncertainly until Xanda quietly knelt beside the child. She smiled encouragingly, and without a single instruction, Bryce handed her the clean cloth she needed before gently distracting the pup with a small carved wooden whistle lying nearby. The child's tears quickly disappeared. For the first time, they worked together naturally again, not as ruler and subject, not as two people burdened by expectation, but as equals helping someone who needed them. Later that evening, Bryce removed the royal signet ring from his hand and placed it upon a nearby stone bench instead of offering it to Xantha. "If I ever ask anything of you again," he said softly, "it won't be because I wear this." Xantha looked toward the ring before opening her palm to reveal the silver pendant resting against her fingertips. "My mother wrote that the people who truly love us will walk toward our light instead of asking us to live in their shadow." Bryce nodded, accepting those words without defense or persuasion. He understood that love could no longer be measured by whether she returned with him, but by whether he respected the woman she had become. As sunset painted the valley in warm gold, a messenger finally arrived carrying a sealed letter from Ashen Hollow. The royal council had called an emergency assembly, declaring that the future of the kingdom could not remain uncertain any longer. Bryce folded the message slowly before looking toward Xantha. This time, he did not ask what she would choose. He simply waited, trusting that whatever path lay ahead would have to be walked freely by both of them. In that quiet act of restraint, Xantha saw the clearest proof that the man standing before her was no longer the same Alpha King who had watched her disappear without understanding what he had lost. Bryce Ashford and Xantha Whitmore returned to Ashen Hollow together, yet they did so on separate horses, each respecting the distance the other had earned rather than pretending the past had never happened. Their arrival silenced the capital. Citizens who had celebrated the choosing ceremony now watched the woman they believed had vanished forever walk through the palace gates with quiet confidence instead of hesitation. Inside the council chamber, the elders immediately urged Bryce to restore political certainty by announcing a swift resolution. Instead, he stepped away from the throne and faced the gathering without royal ceremony. "The kingdom has asked me to lead with wisdom," he began calmly. "Wisdom begins by admitting when pride has hidden the truth." He spoke openly of the mistake he had made, not because choosing Celeste Hawthorne had been malicious, but because he had allowed fear of disappointing everyone else to outweigh honest conviction. He acknowledged that no alliance built upon silence could strengthen a kingdom for long. Then he did something no Alpha King before him had ever attempted. Rather than issuing another decree, he invited Celeste to speak first. She rose with graceful composure, thanking Bryce for treating her with respect throughout every difficult conversation. Looking toward the council, she declared that she would never accept a crown offered out of obligation instead of genuine partnership. Her decision ended every political expectation surrounding the ceremony without bitterness, and even the most skeptical elders recognized the dignity of her choice. Only then did Bryce turn toward Xantha. He did not kneel before the court to create a dramatic spectacle, nor did he ask for immediate forgiveness. Instead, he walked to the center of the chamber carrying the small embroidered cloth she had once used to mend his ceremonial cloak and placed it beside her silver pendant upon the council table. "For years," he said softly, "I believed kingdoms were held together by power. I was wrong. They endure because ordinary acts of compassion give people a reason to trust one another. You showed me that long before I understood it." Xantha looked across the room filled with nobles, servants, healers, and guards. Once, standing before so many people would have filled her with uncertainty. Now she spoke with peaceful clarity. "I didn't return because someone finally chose me," she answered. "I returned because I learned to choose myself first. Whatever happens after today must be built on that truth." A long silence followed before Bryce smiled with quiet relief, not because he knew her answer, but because she no longer needed his approval to define her life. Weeks passed as the kingdom adjusted to unexpected change. Bryce reorganized the royal council, giving healers, teachers, and village representatives a permanent voice beside military leaders. Celeste accepted the role of ambassador to neighboring territories, where her wisdom strengthened friendships instead of political bargains. Gideon Mercer remained an honored guest, helping establish a sanctuary within Ashen Hollow so every pack could receive care regardless of status. As for Xantha, she refused every title offered to her until she accepted one on her own terms. Royal Healer, responsible not for serving a crown, but for protecting the people. Only after those changes had taken root did Bryce ask whether she would consider walking beside him, not as a symbol of destiny fulfilled, but as an equal whose heart he intended to earn every single day. This time, Xander reached for his hand because the choice belonged entirely to her. Later that evening, as the palace gradually fell quiet, they found themselves standing once more on the western balcony overlooking the endless forest. The same moonlight that had witnessed years of unspoken affection now bathed the stone railing in gentle silver. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the wind move through the distant trees, just as they had so many evenings before everything changed. Bryce smiled softly. The balcony has been quiet without you. Xander looked toward the horizon before a small smile touched her lips. Perhaps it was waiting for both of us to find our way back. A servant quietly appeared with a tray of warm tea before slipping away unnoticed. Bryce handed one cup to her without expectation. She accepted it with an easy gratitude that needed no explanation. "Would you have tea with me again?" he asked. Xander met his eyes, calm and certain. "This time," she said gently, "only because I choose to." Bryce's quiet laugh carried into the night, lighter than it had been in years. The silver pendant rested against Xander's heart. The embroidered cloth remained folded safely inside Bryce's cloak, and beneath the moon that had once witnessed silent heartbreak, the kingdom of Ashen Hollow finally understood that genuine strength was never measured by the person an Alpha King first chose, but by the humility to recognize the one he nearly lost, and by the wisdom to earn her love instead of expecting it.